Welcome back, everybody. Our next panel will address one of the most pressing questions of our time. How can all of our activities become greener quickly enough to halt the negative environmental impact on our planet? Our moderator for the Green Single European Sky has over 15 years of experience in the ATM community. The Head of Aviation Sustainability at EUROCONTROL, Marylin Bastin.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this panel on a green single European sky. I feel very lucky to be on stage today here at Cologne with such an amazing panel. And I really hope that you will enjoy this panel and the discussion from behind your screen. So the European Commission would like to be the first climate neutral region in the world by 2050 and to reduce the greenhouse gas emission from transport sector by 90% compared with 1990. For this purpose, a deep decarbonization of the aviation sector needs to be ensured. Last February, the aviation industry has published a report called Destination 2050 Report, providing a roadmap to be net zero emission by 2050 based on aircraft and engine technology, the use of sustainable aviation fuel, market-based measures, and of course, ATM. As it has been mentioned earlier this morning by Eamon, EUROCONTROL and EASA have published a paper in May providing 5 proposals for a green single European skies. And for instance, the use of the single European sky charging scheme to incentivize green trajectory is one of these proposals. I must say that when it comes to the traffic, and in the last new traffic forecast for 2021-2027, it is expected that the traffic will be back to 2019 level by the end of 2023. This is, of course, an excellent news for the aviation industry, but it will also increase the pressure on our sector to decarbonize. Flying to the COP26 at Glasgow has been seen as not sustainable, and our sector is still perceived as one of the most difficult to decarbonize. Therefore, this transition to net zero emission needs to be supported by an evolution of the system, allowing aircraft and airspace users to fully exploit their capability to reduce their emission to a minimum. So, how will ATM contribute to the EU Aviation Green Deal? How can ATM deliver significant environmental improvement? How needs the current single European sky to evolve and to align to the new environmental objectives, to the new environmental political objectives? These are some of the questions we will address today with different angles, thanks to our 6 panelists. And so I think it's time now to introduce this amazing panel. And first, I would like to start by introducing Mrs. Christine Berg, Head of Unit Single European Skies within DG Move at the European Commission. We will discuss how the Single European Sky framework could enable the ATM system to support the Green Deal. And then I would like to introduce Mr. Piotr Samson, who will share his view based on 3 different key positions. First, as the Director General of CEA of the Republic of Poland, then as Chair of the EASA Management Board, and finally as Vice President of the EUROCONTROL's Provisional Council. And then I would like to introduce Mrs. Regula Dettling-Ott, Chairwoman of the Performance Review Body of the Single European Skies. We will discuss the Environment Performance Scheme and the associated indicator. And then it's also my pleasure to introduce Mr. Alex Bristol, CEO of Skyguide, the Swiss air navigation service provider, and also chair of FABEC. We will discuss how ANSPs can decrease the emission carbon and to contribute to the EU Green Deal's objective. And then I would like to introduce Mr. Peter Bellew, COO of easyJet. He will share an airline's view on the need for an holistic and coordinated action within the aviation partners, including the ATM system, of course. And finally, I would like to introduce Mrs. Dardenne, aviation manager from Transport and Environment. She will share with an NGO perspective how ATM can contribute to the EU Green Deal. So when it comes to this panel and the organization, I will first give the floor to each of our panelists for a 5-minute speech to share their view about how ATM can contribute to the EU Green Deal. And then I will start a discussion by choosing questions in the Slido. So if you want to shape the discussion, please feel free to enter your question in the Slido. And now I'm sure you are impatient to listen to our panelists. So I would like to start first with Mr. Christine Berg. So Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marylin, and hello to everybody. I think I would like to do at the start of this panel once again a painting of the backdrop against which we are acting from a policy perspective. And it has been mentioned already several times again here today. The guiding ambition is really the fact that aviation, like any other sector of our economy, needs to support climate neutrality to be achieved by 2050. We have seen, in particular before the pandemic, that the aviation sector is a small but steadily growing sector contributing to the overall CO2 emissions. And we also know that this sector is technologically challenged, and therefore there is not going to be one single bullet to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 by that sector, with a step of 55% reductions compared to the 1990 levels by 2030. So the basket of measures that is discussed internationally and in Europe is an important one. And these are in particular the European Emission Trading Scheme and CORSIA, the international equivalent. The hopes and the expectations that are put in sustainable aviation fuels to come, where the Commission has also made an ambitious proposal that is started to be discussed among the policymakers. And of course, there is ambitious funding schemes to support innovation and green investments in all sectors, but also in particular aviation and ATM. The new CESAR joint undertaking has been mentioned already this morning by Eamon Brennan, and we are very happy that this can be started up still in December this year. But I think the challenge is also then to bring this technology into the system, meaning into the systems on the ground and into the aircraft. And that means deployment will see an incredible challenge. And we have also created means and tools on the support scheme side to support large-scale demonstrators, which are good for an environment like aviation in order to test the deployment of new technology and in order to accelerate, I would say, the certification of the technology afterwards by the colleagues from EASA. But overall, and that is actually not that new, there is, depending on how you calculate, this potential of about 10% of reduction of the aviation sector's emissions that can be addressed by better ATM. And with the proposal for an amended single European sky, we are trying to realize this potential as quickly as possible, because certainly ATM can contribute to this potential in a quicker fashion than, for instance, the rollout of new infrastructure that is needed for sustainable aviation fuels. So Our proposal encompasses three major dimensions. The network management is going to be another topic today. The digitalization has also already been referred to. And then the performance of the service provision and the related charging aspects. And I think I would like, as a start, to focus on these aspects because these are aspects that should incentivize and guide the behavior of airspace users on the one hand and of air navigation service providers. In the legislative framework, we have different tools for that. Tools for targeting the airspace users are more related to the charging system and the charging scheme in our legislation. Because obviously how much something costs will have an impact on the behavior or on the equipment of an aircraft. Incentives in relation to air navigation service providers relate to the performance scheme of our legal framework. And that is, first of all, needed because this is a monopolistic industry. And secondly, because performance should be guided into a direction which benefits ultimately passengers and sustainable development, meaning the climate. So what have we encompassed with the proposals we have made and which are currently under negotiation? And you have heard from Mr. Marinescu that the negotiations for a topic as complex as the single European sky see challenges, but nevertheless everybody is well-minded, and I think we will advance persistently, and at least from the Commission side we are committed to that. So we have proposed targeting the airspace users, basically two tools for the new legal framework. One is a common unit rate, which would completely eliminate any incentive for someone to fly flight paths which are driven by the cheapest air navigation charges. I would say this is not a consistent behavior, but it's seen again, and it's often seen. It will become perhaps less relevant as the fuel prices may go up as a result of the climate challenge we have to tackle. But still, it would create a level playing field, at least from an airspace user's perspective. Clearly, it would be ambitious in a sense that behind the curtain the airspace users get to see, there would need to be a machinery in place on how the cached charges are distributed according to eligibility, which would need to be settled for the ANSPs. But in general, this is a tool that could be created in a way so that it remains revenue neutral for the ANSPs. A second proposal that has been made relates to modulation of air navigation charges. Modulation of air navigation charges is already possible today. It is mostly used for the terminal areas and in order to address the problem of noise. But it is hardly used in Europe, and currently I'm only aware of Belgium and Luxembourg, for instance, who are making use of that. And it is certainly not a tool that has been created in order to be used to incentivize a climate-friendly behavior or an environmental sustainable behavior for the en route sector. Why? Because if you want to do something for the en route phase, you have to do it at European level, otherwise it doesn't make much sense. And obviously what you could do, you could offer lower charges that would reward a better climate performance or better equipment or better fuel use. And in return, it would require higher charges for those who are lagging behind. Again, these are tools that are directed at airspace users. For the ANSPs, it should be revenue neutral because they have to render a service for everyone independently whether they fly SAF or they don't. The service that has to be rendered has to be safe. Having said that, of course, there need also to be incentives for ANSPs. And there, I think, again, we can relatively quickly, namely as of 2025, when the next reference period for the single European sky will start, we can upgrade our target mechanisms and our indicators, and you will hear more from that also from our performance review board, and there is a lot of thinking going on amongst all stakeholders on how to achieve this, and rightly so. So we need for that indicators that capture better CO2 emissions. Currently we are using as a target only horizontal flight efficiency for the en route phase, which captures about 35% of the fuel burn if you apply a gate-to-gate approach. So this is certainly not the right instrument we are using. And we are also currently not using any financial incentives for the ANSPs who would achieve the targets, because currently we are only having incentive schemes that reward the provision of capacity and cost efficiency. So these are things which have not really been discussed yet in the negotiations between the European Parliament and the Council. Both sides have set their positions, but they have not started to negotiate and to compromise on those things. So these negotiations will happen and hopefully can be concluded in the course of 2022, which would then leave sufficient time to create the details for a new regulatory period to start in 2025, which would then really reward or penalize the environmental behavior, including the climate impact of all the stakeholders in the ATM system.
Thank you very much, Christine. I'm sure that the new tools that you are proposing with modulation of charges, common unit rate, and also new climate target will raise some reaction, and I'm looking forward to discuss about it later on today. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Piotr for sharing his view, so the floor is yours.
Good morning. Let me start with saying that it's great to be back physically in Cologne in EASA premises. I would like now to share my views primarily as the national regulator, apart from my other roles. Let me begin with some basics, the physics of flight. The diagram you see shows clearly the difference in emission of CO2 with respect to the type of the aircraft, the size of the aircraft, and the level, flight level experienced. And as you see from that, one of the critical elements is the heavy planes and also the vertical flight efficiency. This is exactly what Christine has said. The horizontal flight efficiency currently used as the KPI is only one of the elements. The second very important element is the vertical flight efficiency. And here is the first conclusion. I think the first conclusion should be we should take care of the vertical efficiency of flight, and we should take a special concern about the flight plans of the heavy aircrafts. So they should get a kind of the privilege in the airspace because of the emissions of the CO2. The second element is the horizontal flight efficiency. This is also a very important element, currently one of the KPIs in the performance plans. But let me show you an example from the real case example from Poland. We have the KPI, but the problem is it's, from our perspective, not achievable. And why it's not achievable? Because the algorithm on which it's based assumes the origin and destination. So even if we will introduce the free route airspace over Poland, and you can fly directly over Poland, it doesn't make a difference because what's counted in the algorithm is the O&D. And we believe it should be changed because if you look at the graph, even with the low traffic that we have during the COVID time, still we're not very much lower in terms of the emissions. Now, with the traffic at the level of 60–70%, the traffic is going back, we are above the KPI because of the situation, geopolitical situation, and also the economic situation. And on this graph, you see the reason why it does exist. We have two elements in Poland. On the left-hand slide, you see the situation over our eastern border. We have the conflict zones close to the States. Because of the conflict zones area, flights have to take the detour, and that's why from the CO2 horizontal flight efficiency, this is not effective. But this is a conflict zone situation. We really cannot do much about it. On the right-hand slide, you see the situation that happens on the left side of Poland, and this is what we called flying on the Kostodrome. And this is what Christine has mentioned. This is the effect of the different unit rates. Because of the significant difference in unit rates between Poland and Germany, so two states close to each other, many airlines decide to fly the route that is more economically efficient and not CO2 efficient. That's why I really support the position of the common unit rate, because the common unit rate at least will eliminate the part of our problem and the situation which we have on the border with Germany. In terms of the technical implementation of the common unit rate, I think it's quite simple. We've got the EUROCONTROL, we've got the CRCO, so we've got a mechanism in place. From the technical point of view, it's relatively easy, and I think CRCO will be one of the best institutions within the EUROCONTROL to work as a kind of act as a kind of a clearinghouse. So we've got a common unit rate, but all the ANSPs will get the same amount of remuneration and cash as it is at the moment. So this is just the mathematical algorithm, but it will help very much the horizontal flight efficiency. And let me now go back for a moment again to the vertical flight efficiency. I would like to show you two quotes about the situation of the airports. When you look at Europe, still there's a 70% of the airports which are not profitable. What does it mean? It means that we have a lot of infrastructure, we have a lot of the capacity, but it's not used in the most efficient way. If you look at this diagram, you see the number of airports in all different, split over Europe. Some of the airports, especially the regional airports, they are, what I can say, in the middle of nowhere. That's the different case. But some of the airports, the small airports, are serving the same conurbation as the big airports, the hub airports. And then when we look at we go back to 2019, especially the case of Germany, the Frankfurt airport, I think it was mentioned in the previous panel. we had huge inefficiency of the vertical flight efficiency because of the congestion of the traffic and congestion in one place. And here, going back to my very first slide in the conclusion, I think that in an area where you've got conurbation and when you've got huge congestion, you should take actions to do some kind, which I call the decongestion, and to give the priority to the heavy jets and the operators which operate heavy jets and the traffic feeding the heavy jets. In other words, 777 cannot land at all of these aircrafts, at all of these airports, but the Airbus 321 can land at all of these aircrafts. So I think, from my point of view as a regulator, I would like to have the tool. There is this tool, it's still existing, it's called Administrative Division of Traffic, where I can have some kind of interference and balance the traffic from the CO2, which means decongestion on the hubs, priority to the heavy aircrafts, and the feeding traffic to the heavy aircrafts, where ability, well, I can put some of the traffic flying on narrow bodies on the regional airport, if such an airport exists. Does not happens everywhere, but it's possible. Another element which will be also helping us is the free route airspace. The critical element is the free route airspace across the border, because if there's a free route airspace in one state and the other state, which is neighboring, doesn't have the free route airspace, it doesn't work. So the critical element is the cross-border free route airspace. That will also help us, I think, very much in terms of the vertical flight efficiency. And last but not least, if it all doesn't work, a kind of anecdote. We have between us, our esteemed colleague, a lucky £100 million bonus man, Mr. Joseph Varady. So my alternative will be, if all the CEOs of the airlines, airports and ANSPs in their bonuses will be linked to the vertical flight efficiency and horizontal flight efficiency, I think we'll be happy. Thank you.
Thank you, Piotr. I think it was a little provocative, but quite interesting, and I'm sure it will raise some reaction. And then now I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Regula Dettling-Ott. Please, Regula, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for the invitation to participate in this panel. From the point of view of the PRB, that is the Performance Review Body of the Single European Sky, we look at facts and figures and make recommendations to the European Commission on how to improve the performance and the cost of the current system. But also, of course, we think a lot about how to improve things. Now, in this first slide, you see a bit of input on the question, how much is the contribution that ATM can make to a better performance of aviation in terms of CO2 output. It's interesting, when I was preparing that slide, and as we have realized this morning in different panels, there are different figures out there, but it's undisputed, there is a contribution, and it's always about eliminating inefficiencies. And at the bottom of this slide, you see 3 lines. It's publication from the airlines, from ITAC. It was published in September 2021. And the red line would be the do-nothing scenario, which of course is out of the question. The green line is showing what can the realistic expectation be in terms of contribution, and that calculation says it can be minus 6%. If I would go to an airline CEO and propose I can reduce your fuel bill by 6%, I'm sure I would be hired. And so what also has to be kept in mind, even if it looks small and we are talking about reaching the goal of the Green Deal, which is 2030, meaning that we have an efficient air traffic management also means that airlines have the money to invest in better aircraft and in new technology. And at the end of the day, what I think is also always important to keep in mind, the passenger expects that aviation produces green, and it's everybody, as we have heard in the various panels. If we look at the contributions a bit more detailed, we have heard often that free route airspace, and this to somebody who is not in the details sounds like a wonderful proposition, free route, but actually we know there are still many, many restrictions out there that can be improved. And also what we have learned, unfortunately, from COVID times, that even though there were no capacity issues, it was still not, the performance was still not there where it could be. So we have to know what impedes airlines to choose the most environmental friendly route. As we have heard this morning, it's so simple. The cheapest route should be the most environmental friendly and vice versa. Environmental friendly route should be the cheapest. And then we don't have to think about a lot of incentives, but we have to get there. On the right-hand side of the upper part of this slide, you see what happens if there is congestion. We know our colleagues from the network manager have done a terrific job in 2019, but they were in a firefighting mode. They had to mitigate the failure of about 7 air traffic control centers to mitigate the delays. And what happened, it comes at the cost also in terms of CO2. So, and as we have heard from Piotr, seeing one issue in one country has a lot of effects to others. And fortunately, I must say, these political reasons that you have shown, Piotr, are the exception. And now we have to really work together to not repeat what we saw in 2019. That the failure of a few means that the network manager has to push the traffic to other parts and at the expense of more CO2 output. Then at the bottom, we look at long-term issues. One thing that is interesting to see is it's difficult to focus on the right issues because is it only the fuel burn, or is it also contrails? On that graph, you see an assessment of the uncertainty that is still there in order to assess. What we know today may be completely different in 5 years from now. So a lot of more research is still needed to fully understand what could make the difference. And finally, what about infrastructure improvement? As Christine has said, and what we see from the point of view from the performance review body, it probably has to be a mixture of both. Yes, in some cases, and we have heard it this morning in the first panel, it's just the legal framework just has to provide certain standards everybody has to adhere to. So common standards in technology doesn't lead to what one of our colleagues said this morning, that the same technology is sold in different versions, and if it comes to the worst, it's not even compatible anymore. And there is no economic regulation which can prevent that. It just needs solid standards. On the other hand, yes, there is a room for very stringent economic regulations. Something I would like to add, what you said, Christine, is, for instance, eliminate redundancies. To be blunt, ANSPs should just not get any money for redundancies. Apart from that, we hear from our colleagues from EASA that it can also cause a certain safety issues. And their economic regulation has to make and has a role. Also, when we speak about a unit rate that is the same all over Europe, that requires a strong economic regulations because if you have the same unit rate for the user, that doesn't automatically mean it is also that everybody will get the same money from the production side. So we need to find a good way on to still push efficiencies because it will remain a monopoly structure. So these are my thoughts from the performance review body perspective. Back to you.
Thank you, Regula. I think you made your point. Very interesting topic that has been discussed, and I'm sure that the other panelists would like to react on. So now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Alex Bristol for sharing his view from an ANSP point of view. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marylin. And from an ANSP perspective, one of the things that we see is that there are two angles where we can affect the environment and our green footprint. There's an internal angle, which is obviously to do with our own footprint, to do with the amount of electricity we use, the amount of emissions we create internally to the company, and that's an amount. The much bigger amount, of course, is the effect that we can have on the operations, and the weighting is disproportionate, but I think it's also very important, both for a mindset perspective and in order to demonstrate our credentials, that we focus on both of those as well. So the internal part needs to be worked on. We all need to focus on that increasingly, but we need to spend most of our energy and effort looking externally to see how we can help the network particularly. And I think I'll pick up that point straight away and build on what has been said previously. The network, it needs to be the way we think, not locally, because if we try and optimize locally, we'll end up de-optimizing the network. And free route airspace, as has just been said as well, is a great idea. But if I do free route airspace inside Switzerland and it doesn't connect anywhere around, we've achieved very little. So we need to be thinking network across all of the airspace optimizations that we do. I think that ATM can make a big difference. Exactly what the number is not too important. The fact is there is a number and we need to reduce it, and we can see that as well. I think it's also very clear that we need to think not just network, but we need to think entire aviation system. It's not just one player in any place that's going to make the big difference. It is all of us acting in concert and coordination with each other that will actually deliver the significant improvements that we need in this fashion. And that leads me also on to how do we actually go about some of that. We've heard about technology this morning, and some of that can help, because there is no doubt that if we can use technology to increase the availability of capacity in the system, we can also decrease the inefficiency that's caused by a lack of capacity. On the same front, though, it's not going to solve all of the issues. And an example of that is some of the airspace structures, especially around busy hubs, especially around conurbations. They're designed historically on noise grounds, and they can result in quite a significant increase in the emissions just in order to get onto the route via the noise preferential routing that we've got at the moment. So it's not probably just the CEOs of the ANSPs, the airlines and the regulators who need a bonus on this, but it's the local politicians as well, because if we could actually sort out the airspace structures from the ground to cruise, we would also make a very significant difference within Europe. And I think I will finish with my last point on research as well. So there is the need for a lot more research here. I'm confident that we will find in the fullness of time that some of the things that we're doing at the moment weren't quite the right things to do, but we must not let that be a reason not to do anything. We've got to do what we can at this moment in time, continue in parallel the research to understand what it is we should be doing, how we should be designing airspace, how we should be designing our technology, how the aircraft, the airports and the airspace managers should combine to optimize that network in a longer term future, because we've got a job to do between now and 2050. We've also got to do a job in the next few years as well. And we have to all, I think we've all got a duty to do what we can now, but also to plan to make sure we deliver that optimization into the future.
Thank you, Alex. I think it's a quite interesting message that you just convey, because it's we need the collaboration of all airspace and aviation stakeholders, but we also need the support from the state and also the local authorities. And I think that this is a quite strong, important message to convey on this. Thank you very much. And then I would like to give the floor to Mr. Piotr Bellew from an ANSP point of view, from an airline point of view, sorry.
Great, thank you very much. So just the first thing I'd like to say is to say thank you to EASA for organising this event. And more importantly, I think for last year, May 2022, they came up with a safe framework for the airlines and the other stakeholders to get back operating. And if you hadn't shown that leadership globally, I actually don't think we would have got aviation back flying to the extent we have at this stage. And I think there's great hope for 2022. Certainly the consumer demand appears to be, I hope every ATM manager in the building here today has every available air traffic controller in place for next June. I actually think we will see almost a complete return to 2019 levels of traffic, other than maybe for long haul by June 22, and certainly the strength that's out there in the marketplace is there. I think, if you look at sustainability and aviation sustainability generally, I don't think we'll see a significant technological leap in electric or hydrogen aircraft until well after I've retired from the business. And sustainable aviation fuel, my figures I've seen is if we were to use SAFs for the majority of flying globally, we would need to double the amount of crop production on the planet. And there simply isn't enough land, enough farmers, and I can't even imagine the damage to the environment from farmers from the fertilizers. So ATM in a way is our only short to medium term hope of changing this thing. And actually it's really interesting that you said 6% is the number, because separately, over the last 6 years, 6% is the number that I've seen. And in China, where they've done a lot of work on this, with trials in Bohai and also in Shanghai, 6% actually was the number that they came up with from very advanced trials, where they were actually able to embed the GBAS and the SBAS and the aircraft. And you know what? If we got to 6%, it would be fantastic. I think the technology is there. I think performance-based navigation, which is a simple enough concept. When it was first put out there in 2007, 2008, 2009, the technology was very expensive. Ground-based augmentation systems and satellite-based systems, they were very expensive, capital-intensive. They were difficult to obtain. Actually, now they're almost at the level of consumer devices, in that some of these devices, Flight Radar 24, will provide you for $60 with something that cost about $6 million just a couple of years ago. Probably the training and probably the integration is the most difficult piece. And actually there's a political element that is way above my pay grade of how do we get EUROCONTROL, the network manager, and the Single European Skies to get the financial backing from Europe to do it. Personally, if it was my job, I'd probably task the European Investment Bank to offer relatively soft long-term loans to all of the ANSPs across the 42 states to implement the technology. I think you'd have to have one technology provider doing a cross 42 country plan to install the same systems. I think if you had the correct systems in place, that the airlines will buy into it very quickly. You have a relatively clear structure of airlines in Europe, and we generally have quite a modern aviation fleet relative to other countries. It's not just about sustainability. If you have very predictable ATM systems, it makes it incredibly safe for the flight crew operating the flight. If you're able to fly at a much slower speed and a lower cost index, there's significant savings on fuel for the aircraft, but it's actually also much safer for the flight crew. For the customer on board the aircraft, if we got this working properly, we'd have what's called continuous descent approaches, and basically that's kind of gliding in for the last 100 nautical miles. That saves a lot of fuel. It's incredibly quiet on board the aircraft. It's tremendously quiet for passengers on the ground. And actually there's a hidden saving for the airlines. It can prolong engine shop visits by up to 2 years of the aircraft. And you almost eliminate the risk of there being unscheduled engine maintenance visits, shop visits. So it's got a load of benefits around it. I think the key to me is how do we accelerate this? I think it needs money put behind it, and I don't think that's just money to fund the Single European Skies project. I think effectively we need to say we need to invest in some technology here, but it's not rocket science stuff. And I think the European Investment Bank for me would be the one that would probably be able to do it. If we got that in place, you actually could jumpstart this whole process. And I think we could probably get to that 6% very quickly. We would see, as I say, cross benefits in fuel savings. We would see massive benefits in noise reduction, in excellent track deviation numbers coming from the airlines. And most importantly, on the safety side, we would see benefits like that as well. So that's it from my angle. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I think it's really important, again, your message here, because of the role of the technology for the environmental improvement, of course. And also, I think that this idea, that we should give some long-term loan to the ANSP to invest in technology, I think you have new friends now, thanks to this proposal. So thank you, Peter. And now I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Jo Dardenne, the last one. So the floor is yours. Please, Jo.
Thank you, Marylin. And thank you, EASA, for inviting us to speak today. I think, the question around what role the ATM and, the Single European Sky can play to reach the Green Deal objectives, I first want to come back on what the Green Deal is actually about for aviation. Now, we know the Green Deal is about implementing, the Paris Agreement objective to make sure that all sectors of the economy reach or help the EU reach its climate targets. And that means aviation as well. And unfortunately, aviation has been way off course to help the EU reach its climate targets for 2030, but even for 2050. And that is due to decades of, under-regulation, over-subsidization, and I think that needs to change. Now, we talk a lot about CO2 emissions, but, some now talk a lot about non-CO2 emissions. And I agree that there are still some uncertainties, but we now know, thanks to scientific understanding that has improved, that non-CO2 emissions are 2/3 of aviation's total climate impact. So it's not just about CO2 alone, it's also about non-CO2. And that's where also ATM plays an important role, and I'll mention later. But so what does the Green Deal, put forward for aviation? First of all, pricing emissions more effectively. We need to integrate the polluter pay principle more clearly. Second, we need to deploy clean aviation fuels, sustainable aviation fuels. And 3, we need to make sure that we remove any operational inefficiencies. And of course, we see, as TNE, we see this as a package, and we don't want to cherry pick those measures that we want implemented first or more, and that should apply to the industry, and that should also apply to governments. And when we see, the ATM and the Single European Sky, it's quite surprising that since 2009, the last time that the SES was applied, traffic has increased to over 1 billion passengers, emissions have increased by 30%, but yet we're still using the same system we were using in 2009. So there is, economic and environmental nonsense, I would say, for in the way that the air traffic management applies today, especially when it comes to having flights that are not environmentally optimized, but that are economically optimized. As you said, how can it be so cheap to pollute? It should be cheap to be green, and it should be expensive to pollute. Fundamentally, we believe in this package. We believe that air traffic management can play a role. Now, unfortunately, we don't think that it's 10% savings, but more around 5 to 6% savings. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and implement those changes and operational changes to make sure that we arrive to these savings, because they are important, and as mentioned, they can be done quickly. But unfortunately, we have to point out, the hypocrisy of some governments and member states calling for high SAF mandates or taxing emissions. But unfortunately, now they're not implementing those quick solutions for better operational efficiency. So ATM can play a role. We have to be realistic about the savings that can be achieved. It's part of the puzzle, but first we need to agree on what can be the solutions to reduce emissions. And we believe it is to change the fuel that is being burnt by planes today. And ATM then can play a role, and the Single European Sky can then play a role to shift decarbonization, to promote and incentivize those solutions. And that is key. And I hear a lot of my fellow panelists mentioning technology is there, we need to implement it, but there's no regulation. And that's the same for non-CO2 emissions. We've been talking about non-CO2 emissions for decades, but there has been no regulation to force or incentivize airlines, ANSPs, governments to actually put in place pilot projects to avoid areas in the sky that produce a lot of contrails, to invest in sustainable aviation fuels that can reduce the number of particulate matter and aromatics that lead to contrail formation. So there are a number of technology providers, Thales, Safran, there's also Microsoft. There are a lot of things that are ongoing, but we need to implement them because otherwise, we're going to face a bigger climate emergency than we are facing today. And to finish, I think I will mention, we hear a lot of, airlines are under attack, the aviation sector is under attack. Actually, the Green Deal is there to save the aviation sector from a climate disaster. We know that there are a number of airports that are at risk of coming underwater by the end of the century. We know that extreme weather and increasing temperatures can have a significant impact on how we fly and if we can fly. So if we don't put in place the solutions today, we're going to face an even bigger problem tomorrow.
Thank you, Jo, and for this focus on the non-CO2 that indeed we should not forget because it's part of the complexity of the challenge that we have to face. So thank you very much. And now I propose that we start the question and answer session, and so our discussion. I'm pleased to see that there are already many questions in the Slido. So I propose that we start with one question. I think that it will be for Piotr, because it's about you. And with this question, is the single unit rate or the modulation of charges a good solution to incentivize fuel optimal trajectory? So I think it's for you.
I think it makes perfect sense. And I think, in reality, other than you have to try and get 42 people around the table and have some arm wrestling very late at night to get it, I think from the airline's point of view, it would make perfect sense. And you'd actually see a change in behavior almost immediately. You'd probably see it within, it would require, even from the manufacturers, there's three main manufacturers of the software that manage the flight planning. If they had heads up of something like this, even maybe 12 weeks in advance, they could adjust the templates and you could refile with EUROCONTROL Network Manager because that's quite efficient now, the way that works. So, I think that would make a radical change and it would be safer. It was very instructive to me to see that the Peter's slide where he showed the pattern of traffic and you've got vast amounts of traffic going on the same routing and then some of those aircraft are all having to travel at the same higher speed than they really need to be operating at, which is just, it's scandalous really in terms of carbon and usage of fuel, but also it's safer if you're going slower. So yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Thank you, Peter. And I think that I have also a question for Alex now, from an ANSP point of view. I see a question from Xavier from NavBlue. What action projects have been taken by ANSP to actually give the opportunity to operator to fly continuous descent operation and continuous climb that represent fuel and CO2 savings?
Well, there are a number of different projects that have been done, many of them led by CESAR, and the CESAR JU have put in place a number of trials which have been done over the years. And various ANSPs and groupings of ANSPs have also done certain things. So examples would be arrival management, would be the extended arrival management, XMAN, which tries to go back from the congestion point of the runway threshold and slow aircraft down as they come in on their cruise before they get to top of descent so that they don't have to go round and round the holding pattern. As an example, in Zurich, in 2019, so before COVID, we managed to reduce the holding at Zurich by 90%, just by use of slowing down the aircraft before they came into the intermediate approach stage. So those are a couple of very concrete things that happen. There are a lot more activities ongoing in that area, and I think that it's safe to say that we are more mature on the continuous descent operations than we are on the continuous climb operations, and we need now to start working on those. That has a significant link to what I mentioned earlier on, and that's the airspace structure. Another example of something that ANSPs are doing is the Maastricht Upper Area Centre trial about contrails. Over the last year or so, they've been trying to see if they can, by changing the flight level of the aircraft, to avoid creation of contrails during the night, to see what that's doing. And I think all of these things aid to both our understanding of the situation, research, and to reduce the non-CO2 emissions part of the system.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. I think that we have also a quite interesting question, but maybe there it will be more for Christine. Do you expect any specific political directive to come out of the COP26, that could help us to enable the CES2+ proposal?
No, that's the short answer. I don't think COP26 is going to discuss anything which is directly related to the Single European Sky or ATM. What hopefully we get out is more awareness, more conscious that it is time to act and that we have to act all together. And the earlier we can act, the better it will be for everybody. And that, but you have to make the conclusion yourself, should put ATM at the center stage when it comes to short-term activity in the aviation sector.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I see that Regula would like also to comment, please.
Yes, maybe I can be a bit more blunt in answering the question we had before, and which you, Alex, addressed, and what we are seeing now when this high-level discussion in Glasgow. What I find extremely challenging is to convert so much agreement into action. Yeah. This gap has not shrunk. I'm very optimistic, maybe has even become bigger. For instance, if we look at what is happening now with the discussion about the new proposal from the European Commission, it's more of, allow me to be very blunt, it's member states trying to still adhere to an older system, as you have said, which needs a common approach to really overcome. And unfortunately, I don't have a solution, but it is really difficult to cover that gap.
Yeah.
And not only the revenue gap that we have seen during COVID crisis.
Thank you, Regula. And I see that Joe would like to intervene from an NGO.
Yes, I think maybe to add on your point, Regula, is that the issue that we face often in those international arenas is, aviation is an international mode of transport, so it should be dealt with at an international level. Unfortunately, maybe on safety, it's the case and it has worked well, and ICAO has proven to work well, but on environment, it has not worked well. And we're faced with issues with an offsetting scheme that is too cheap, with discussions on what kind of SAF to promote that are actually not sustainable at all. And that's why also I want to point out the hypocrisy, as you just mentioned, of some member states going to these conferences and calling for more ambition and climate ambition on aviation, but refuse to do the little things that matter within their own scope and their own region. And if the EU is to lead as they want on climate ambition on aviation, they should put in place the measures that are included in the Green Deal, and they should not be distracted by other regions trying to undermine their climate ambition on the excuse that we need an international solution rather than regional solutions.
Thank you, Joe. I think I have a question for Piotr now. Maybe Peter.
Yeah, just a comment on that.
Of course.
There is some European regulatory structures that could be used. If you think about mobile phone systems, the EU mandated that the GSM system had to be the same across 42 countries or whatever it was. And we cross borders and we roam with our phone and we don't even notice it's happening, So that was mandated. That's a technological solution that was there that said you all have to use the same frequencies. So that could be a route that could be used. But also, I think it will require regulatory and legal mandates at the highest level to give the network manager the ability to be able to control the ANSP environment. Because if you don't do that, there'll always be outliers, and if there's just one or two large outliers, the whole thing never works. So I think, but there is precedent in the mobile phone industry to see how it could be done.
Yeah, interesting. So now to come back to Piotr, maybe a question for you, because we didn't discuss about the role of the military. And so I see a question here received on the slide. To what extent can the CES support improve civil and military coordination and effective implementation of flexible use of airspace? So do you have...
Well, I can just, you say from the national experience, from the Poland experience, we have a very good coordination with the military. And actually it's interesting because 30, 40 years ago, most of the airspace of Europe was controlled by the military. Now it's the other way around. So most of the space is controlled by the civil ATC, but coordination is critical, especially with the areas when you still got a lot of military activity. So I think that the need to be, first of all, a legal base, a legal platform for that, but then the critical element is the operational cooperation, and I think also the EUROCONTROL is doing a great job because the EUROCONTROL is the civil military organization. It's not just the civil organization. So I think this is very, very important, and this cooperation between the civil and military with the more and more congested airspace, I think it's critical.
Thank you, Piotr. Regula, you wanted to complement?
Yes, thank you. One thing that I think is important to look at is the facts and figures. And for instance, what we saw in the 2-3 past years in our monitoring of the performance, we see the big issue, of course, is with the civil and military coordination to make sure that if the military, which has priority over airspace, if it releases the airspace, that airlines actually pick it up and use the opportunity to fly a better route. And there is still a lot of room for improvement. For whatever operational reasons, airlines cannot or do not make use of this released airspace the way we would have expected to see that. And secondly, I also think, yes, this question comes up very, very often. It is an important question, but the effect should not be overestimated.
Yeah.
Even if we have perfect coordination between released airspace from the military and being picked up for civil aviation, it will not solve our problems.
Thank you, Regula. I would propose that we just ask a last question because the time is running fast. It's about the idea that have been proposed by Piotr. So what do you think about avoiding big hub and sharing traffic to regional airport, point to point, to help to decrease emission? But it's more than this. It was also to manage the capacity in the network instead of proposing some level capping to the airlines to share the traffic to regional airport to avoid this level capping. And I think maybe, Peter, as an airline, you have something to say about this.
Yeah, like I think regional airports have a huge role to play, not just on the sustainability issue, but actually the sustainability of rural Europe. And it's all fine and dandy, people who live in a big city saying, well, we shouldn't have all these regional airports. But as somebody who's been involved in regional airports in my past, there are many of the regional airports, and right throughout Switzerland's a good example, that if you didn't have them and they weren't vibrant and they weren't maintained, and some of them lose a lot of money in their own regard, but actually the revenue they generate is astonishing. It's a small community I come from in the periphery, the west of Ireland, Kerry Airport, and this knock up the road. That there are vast tens of thousands of people in our region who actually wouldn't be living there anymore over the last 20 years, these regional airports. So I think they're really important, and they do have a role in sustainability, because a lot of them, they're really efficient. You can do a lot of 15-minute turnarounds in a lot of regional airports across Europe, where you're making up for maybe 20 minutes lost in a hub airport somewhere else. So I think they have a great role for the future.
Thank you, Peter. And Piotr, you would like to react?
Yes, I think we were discussing this yesterday, actually, this point. I would say in general, yes, but. And the but is when you look at the conurbation and when you look at the two airports, the big airport and let's say the smaller airport serving the same conurbation, I think a lot depends on the structure of the ATC and the traffic. And one of the key elements is whether the runways are parallel or not. Because if you have two airports and the one runway is 90% at the different direction than the other runway, that creates enormous complexity for the ATC. So in this case, probably from the flight path and from the ATC point of view, that won't be the efficient way for the CO2 emission. But if you have the two airports, let's say one is in the north, the other is in the south more or less 100 kilometers, and they have the parallel runways, then I think from the CO2 emission and the effectiveness of the descent and also takeoff, I think that's the better solution.
Yeah, thank you. Alex, you would like to have a final word?
Piotr has just actually taken one of my 2 points away from me. So the other point that I think I'd like to make there as well is maybe this is something that we need to think about in a slightly different way. If we pitch ourselves in 2040 for the sake of argument, we should be thinking about multimodality as well, and not just about the aircraft, but maybe thinking about how we can join everything in the transport chain together as well, rather than just thinking about the aircraft. And that would lead to this being quite an interesting new idea as well, therefore. And in summary, all of that is, I think we need to think differently to get to 2040, to get to 2050, and that also means that we have a duty to act now for our children and for our grandchildren.
Thank you, Alex. Christine, please.
Perhaps 2 points in the last round. Peter promoted performance-based navigation, PBN, as one tool to improve the environmental efficiency of ATM. I entirely agree. But I would also like to take the advantage of the fact that we are sitting here in an EASA-hosted conference, that EASA has an important role to play in order to make sure that this is also implemented. We have rules for that in Europe. Actually, by 2024, it should work. We are in the first round and we see that many member states have not done anything yet. So this is really disappointing. And this brings me to my second point, which we have not mentioned in this panel, but which was mentioned in all the other panels, and I think I would entirely concur with it. We need political will to drive reforms. It was good to hear for me here today in this panel that things like modulation of charges, even common unit rate would be something which is welcome. Well, other than in the European Parliament, on the side of the states, they don't want this very clearly. And I also have to say from airspace users, I have heard different things before. So I take it that this panel has started some rethinking or, but I also feel that it needs to percolate to decision makers, and the decision makers are still not aware of the problems there. And the other issue is I also see that there are many things to learn from other sectors. And I feel the aviation industry is very much self-centric. When I hear things about airspace restructuring in order to deal with local routes and noise, etc. I mean, this is the energy sector knows the NIMBY, not in my backyard syndrome since decades. They deal with it every day when it comes to the construction of transmission lines or wind power parks, etc. And I think their states have learned that these things require an awful lot of local investments from politicians. And I think it's also unfair to leave that only to a local community to tell them, you need to change that. There needs to be engagement from everybody and from the highest political level in order to drive these changes, to which all of us will need to contribute.
Thank you, Christine. We are really out of time. So normally I had prepared some wrap-up, but I will not do it because I think that the message has been passed with our panelists. So I would like to thank you, each of you, for this amazing participation and contribution. It has been an honor for me to moderate this panel, so thank you very much. And I would also like to thank you, all the audience behind your screen. I really hope you enjoyed the discussion, and I thank you very much, and I give the floor back to Janet. Thank you.
So thank you very much to everybody on the panel, to Marylin for running it. I think it was a very lively and dynamic discussion. We're now going to move on to lunchtime. We expect to resume here at 1400, so we'll see you all back again then. Thank you. Bye-bye.